September 3, 1945. Southampton Dock, England, 4:47 a.m. A British officer pressed a pistol to the back of a German woman's skull and told her to walk. Not to talk, not to look, not to breathe too loudly, just walk. 847 German women shuffled in a single line through the fog, wrists bound with rope, eyes, forward, hearts hammering against their ribs like trapped birds against a cage. Behind them, the ruins of a civilization. Ahead of them, a ship, a Liberty ship, American flagged, its hull black against the gray morning water. The officer barked one final order before handing them over to American custody. Close your eyes when they tell you. Do not look at anything. Do not speak unless spoken to. Do not resist. And then he added something that froze every woman in line. The Americans will blind you if you see too much. Kia. Greta Hartman was 22 years old. She was not a general, not a war criminal, not a politician who had sent young men to die in frozen fields. She was a radio operator from Berlin, trained to translate coded bursts into language, to press her fingers against transmitter keys with the same precision a pianist presses ivory. She had a mother who baked rye bread on Sundays, a sister who plaited her hair every morning before school, a voice that neighbors said sounded like spring when she sang from the apartment window. Now her hands were raw from sea salt and rope burn. Her uniform was stiff with sweat and 3 days without sleep. Her last transmission had been April 30th, 1945. The day the signal died, the day the 1,000-year Reich collapsed into static and ash. She had not slept since. The ship smelled of oil and old iron and fear. There were no windows in the lower compartments. The air was hot and stale, the kind of air that makes you feel like the walls are breathing in when you breathe out. The women sat pressed against each other on wooden benches, shoulders touching not for warmth, but because there was simply no space to be alone with their terror. Above them, the Atlantic waited. 12 days. 12 days of darkness. Tin cups, watery porridge, served once each morning by young American MPs who said very little and watched with faces carved from years of Pacific landings and European winters. They did not hit anyone. They did not scream. They only stared with the specific kind of silence that belongs to men who have seen too much to be impressed by anything else. Greta counted the hours by the sound of the hull. The slap and drag of water against metal, rhythmic and indifferent, as if the ocean did not know or care that a war had ended. She pressed her palm flat against the cold metal wall and felt the vibration of the engines deep in her bones. She told herself she would survive. She had told herself that every day for 4 years. The habit was stronger than the fear. And then on the 12th day, land. September 15th, 1945. Camp Hearn, Texas, 6:12 a.m. The heat hit them before the light did. Greta stepped off the train onto a wooden platform, and the Texas morning pressed against her face like a warm hand. The sky was already white at the edges, the sun climbing fast, the air dry and enormous, in a way that had no equivalent in Berlin. Everything smelled different. Red soil, distant grass, something warm and sweet she couldn't immediately name. She blinked. Hard. No guards were shouting. No boots were crashing against concrete in that particular rhythm that German soldiers used to announce their authority. There were American MPs with rifles, yes, but they stood easy, almost casual, their posture that of men who had nothing left to prove. A young corporal with red hair and freckles consulted a clipboard. He looked up and pointed, not at them, but down a gravel path lined with wooden barracks. "This way," he said in a tone that was simply direction. No threat inside it. They walked. Past rows of low wooden buildings, past a flagpole where the American flag stirred lazily in a warm breeze, past blooming crepe myrtles in pale pink. Past a fat calico cat sunning itself on a window ledge. The cat looked at Greta, blinked once, closed its eyes again. Greta had not seen something so completely unbothered by the war in 4 years. Barrack 4C was clean. That was the first shock, clean floors smelling faintly of bleach and floor wax. Bunk beds with wool blankets folded at military precision. A basin of fresh water. A window, an actual window letting in pale light. A row of hooks along the wooden wall, each one stamped with a number. Greta stood in the doorway and did not move. The other women filed in slowly behind her, each one pausing, each one doing the same silent calculation. Is this real, or is this the cruelest trick they could have devised? In Berlin, they had been told about the Americans. Chaos people, corrupt and graceless men without honor, women without virtue. They had been told the Americans would parade female prisoners naked through the streets. They had been told there would be violence. There had been briefings, prepared scripts for maintaining dignity under torture. No one had briefed them for clean floors and folded blankets. The red-haired corporal appeared at the doorway. He looked around at the frozen women and scratched the back of his neck. "Name?" he asked Greta. She hesitated. "Hartman. Greta." He took out a piece of chalk and scratched it onto the wooden bedpost. Then he smiled. Not cruelly, not triumphantly, just the way a neighbor might smile when they pass you on the stairs. He pointed to the corner bunk, then to the basin of water. Then he left. Greta sat down on the bunk. No one spoke. Outside, somewhere across the camp, something incredible was happening. Something was baking. The smell came first, warm, yeasty, alive. Not the black, dense rye of Berlin breadlines, not the synthetic approximation of wartime rations. This was bread, actual bread made with time and care and something approaching joy. It drifted through the thin walls of Barrack 4C like a ghost from another world. Someone began to cry. Not loudly, just a soft weeping into cupped hands, the kind that happens when a body doesn't know what else to do with relief. The next morning, they were taken to the mess hall. Long wooden tables, tin trays. American soldiers sat at the far end of the room eating their own breakfast, talking quietly, not watching. A man with dark skin and kind eyes ladled something thick and golden into Greta's bowl. Oatmeal. He added a square of butter already melting and a slice of white bread, soft fresh steam rising from the cut. "Eat," he said. "You'll need strength." Greta stared at the bread. A soldier passing by set down a crate of red apples and began handing them out one to each woman. When his hand touched hers during the exchange, she froze. His palm was warm. His fingernails were clean. When she whispered, "Danke," he looked her in the eye and said, "You're welcome, ma'am." Ma'am. She had been called many things in 4 years of service. She had never been called ma'am. No. The apple was red and real and heavy. She turned it in her hands and didn't eat it for a long time, because eating it felt like admitting something she wasn't ready to admit. The soap arrived on a Monday late September. Greta had been hauling wet sheets from the laundry basin, her hands raw from the scrubbing, her neck scorched by a sun that had no mercy for skin that had spent 4 years under German skies. She wrung out the last sheet and was reaching for the line when a shadow crossed her arm. An American nurse, late 20s, auburn hair tucked beneath a white cap, red cross stitched on her sleeve. She was holding something in her open palm. "For dish," the nurse said carefully in broken German. "A gift." She placed it in Greta's hand. It was a bar of milled soap, pale ivory, wrapped in waxed paper stamped with the word Lux. Beneath the wrapper, lavender, and beneath that, something softer. Vanilla, perhaps. The suggestion of perfume, not strong, not theatrical. Just the whisper of something feminine and human and entirely unnecessary to a prisoner's survival. The nurse smiled once and walked away. Greta stood at the laundry line until the other women had gone back inside. She held the soap in both hands as if it might shatter. Then she brought it to her face, and she broke. Not loudly, not spectacularly. The way ice breaks in early spring, the crack running deep before the surface shows any sign. She smelled her sister's hair on Sunday mornings. She smelled her mother's kitchen. She smelled the blouse she had worn at 17, pressed and sweet the last time the world had seemed like a place that might treat her gently. That night she sat on her bunk and unwrapped the soap slowly. She ran her fingers over the smooth, petal-shaped surface, curved and perfect, utterly untouched by war. She passed it silently to Gisela, who held it, inhaled sharply, and passed it to Sabine. They passed it around like a relic. Each woman held it for a few seconds, in complete silence. No one asked where it came from. They knew what it meant. Someone had thought of them as women. Not prisoners, not enemies, not bodies to be counted and catalogued. Women. And that was harder to survive than any punishment the propaganda films had promised. Sabine tucked the soap beneath her pillow before they slept. "To keep the dreams kind," she said. October brought colder nights. The Texas wind found the gaps in the wooden walls and moved through them with a particular efficiency, and government-issue blankets worn thin from months of use were no match for it. The women pulled them tighter and said nothing. They were alive. They were fed. Cold seemed like an ungrateful complaint. Then Riley appeared at the barrack door one evening, carrying a clipboard and 2 folded wool blankets, thick, heavy, new-smelling of cedar and machine grease and honest manufacture. "Blanket exchange," he said. "Cold front coming." Nobody moved. He looked around and scratched his neck. "It's not a punishment. It's just blankets." Greta stood first. She followed him to the quartermaster's shed where supplies were stacked, floor-to-ceiling linens, boots rations, the vast logistical architecture of American military life. He handed her 2 blankets. Heavy. Real. "Take these to your girls," he said. "You need them more than we do tonight." She looked at him in the lamplight. He was no older than she was. "Why are you kind to us?" she asked. He didn't answer immediately. Then, "My uncle was in a German camp in '44. He said the worst part wasn't the cold or the hunger. It was being treated like an animal." He looked down. "I figured if we're going to build anything after this war, we'd better start acting like people again."
Betty.
Greta carried the blankets back across the dark camp like they were made of something more valuable than wool. She handed one to Gisela, one to Sabine. They touched the fabric the way people touch things they aren't sure are real. That night she lay beneath warmth she had not earned and could not repay, and she thought about a Russian prisoner she had watched slip on ice in Berlin. She had been 19. An officer had kicked him and laughed. She had laughed too. She lay in the dark for a long time, not sleeping, not quite awake in that particular territory where guilt and gratitude are indistinguishable from each other. And then at the end of October, the letter came. Riley found her returning from kitchen duty, her apron dusty with flour, and held out a manila envelope stamped with the Red Cross seal, opened for inspection and resealed. The handwriting on the front was barely recognizable as her mother's, fragile, as if written by someone whose hands had forgotten the motion. Greta went back to the barrack and held it in her lap for a long time before opening it. The others gathered without being asked. Gisela placed her hand on Greta's knee. Sabine whispered, "Go slowly." The letter was 1 page, brown paper reused, edges faded. "My dearest Greta, if this letter finds you, then we are still lucky. Berlin is gone. The house is gone. Your aunt is dead. Your cousin is missing. But I am still here. I worry what you must think of me, of what I allowed you to become. We all believe things that now feel like dust. I am sorry. Accept their kindness. Let go. You were always my bright one. I remember your voice on the stairs. You sang when you were little. Do you remember Sing Again, Greta? Even if it is far from home, I love you. I forgive you. Mama." Greta pressed the letter to her lips and made no sound. The others stayed close, but gave her space, a quiet circle of women who understood that sometimes it is not bombs that break a person. It is paper. She kept the letter in her uniform pocket for days, reading it again before sleep, and again each morning. One line returned to her again and again, the one that hurt most because she was not ready to accept it. "Yet I forgive you." She had followed orders. She had believed. She had sent signals that directed forces towards cities that buried children. She had laughed when she should have wept and saluted when she should have walked away. But her mother's words, brittle and unflinching, cracked something open that no bomb had reached. She asked the chaplain for paper and sat alone in the chapel, with light falling through the slatted wooden walls, and wrote, "Dearest Mama, I am alive. The Americans are not monsters. One gave me soap, another gave me bread. A boy with freckles gave me a blanket when the wind turned cold. I am not the girl you raised, but I am no longer the soldier I became. Something is changing in me. I smell again, I hear again, I feel again, and now I sing again. I love you. I carry you with me in every breath, Greta." But the story was not finished. Not for Greta Hartman. Not for the 847 women in Camp Hearn. Not for the Americans who stood watch over them and made decisions each day about what kind of people they intended to be when the guns went quiet. Because what happened next, what the American military did in the final weeks of 1945 that shocked their own commanders, divided their officers, and created a controversy that was buried in classified files for decades, was something no one had prepared for. Not the Germans, not Washington, not the Red Cross. Not even the women themselves. In Part 2, we go inside the classified decision that changed everything the moment one American officer made a choice so unexpected, so forbidden by the rules of occupation, that his superiors threatened court-martial. A choice that 847 German women would remember for the rest of their lives. And a choice that quietly, without headlines, without medals, without anyone watching, may have done more to end the real war than any battle ever could. Don't forget to hit like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you don't miss what comes next. Join us as we continue exploring these extraordinary stories, forgotten moments, and the human decisions that shaped history in ways the textbooks never told you. No. She had survived the ship, survived the fence, survived the soap that broke her open, and the blanket that rebuilt her, and the letter that cracked her chest like spring ice. Greta Hartman had learned to sleep again, to eat again, to hear music without flinching. She had written to her mother. She had begun slowly and painfully to imagine a life after the wire. But 847 women were not the only ones making decisions inside Camp Hearn in the autumn of 1945. One American officer had watched everything. He had watched the women arrive terrified and leave their fear at the mess hall door. He had watched kindness do what interrogation could not. And he had written a report 12 pages single-spaced that landed on the desk of his commanding general like a grenade with the pin still in. The report recommended something so far outside military doctrine that 3 senior officers laughed when they read it. One called it sentimental. One called it dangerous. One called it treason. And here is where the real war began. And Colonel James Whitfield had spent 22 months in the Pacific before his reassignment to the POW administration program. He was 41 years old, soft-spoken in the way that men who have seen too much tend to become, with the kind of stillness that made junior officers nervous because they couldn't tell if he was thinking or simply done talking. He had watched the women of Camp Hearn for 6 weeks before he wrote a single word. What he saw contradicted everything the occupation doctrine assumed about enemy prisoners. The women were not defiant. They were not broken either. They were, and this was the word he used in his report, the word that made General Harold Bryce throw the document across his desk, receptive. Whitfield's report argued that the standard repatriation model was producing the wrong result. Send prisoners home empty-handed, humiliated, stripped of identity, and you send them home as enemies. You rebuild hatred. You plant the seeds of the next war. He had statistics, interviews, documented behavioral changes over 6 weeks of what he called dignity-based detention. He wanted to formalize it, not just for Camp Hearn, for every German POW facility under American administration. A structured program of human treatment as a deliberate strategy of post-war reconstruction. General Bryce called him into the office on October 22, 1945. Whitfield stood at attention. Bryce didn't offer him a seat. "You understand what you're asking for, Colonel?" "Yes, sir. I'm asking for a policy shift. You're asking me to spend American taxpayer resources making enemy prisoners comfortable." Bryce said the word like it had a bad smell, while American boys are still being buried in France. "I'm asking us to decide what kind of Germany we want in 1955, sir. And in 1965. Bryce leaned forward. "You're a soldier, Whitfield, not a philosopher. And if this report reaches Washington before I kill it, you will spend the remainder of your career counting blankets in Alaska. Are we understood?" Whitfield held his gaze for 3 seconds. "Understood, sir." He left the office. He did not destroy the report. He had 9 days before the first repatriation transport left for Bremerhaven. 9 days to prove what 6 weeks of observation had shown him. 9 days before 847 women boarded a ship and became once again simply data prisoner numbers, transport manifests, closed files. He needed one person, someone with rank high enough to override Bryce's veto. Someone who had seen what Whitfield had seen and understood what it meant. He found her on a Wednesday afternoon in the camp infirmary, writing notes on a clipboard, with the efficiency of someone who has learned not to waste motion. Major Eleanor Marsh, Red Cross liaison. Former field nurse, North Africa, 1943. The kind of woman who had seen enough suffering to recognize its opposite when it appeared. She had also, Whitfield knew, filed her own reports. Reports that had reached the desk of Brigadier General Thomas Alcott, a man who had lost a son at the Bulge and spent every waking hour since trying to make sure it had meant something. Whitfield sat across from Marsh in the infirmary and put the report on the table between them. She read it without speaking. When she finished, she looked up. "Bryce will bury you," she said. "I know. Alcott might not. That's why I'm talking to you." She tapped the report once with her finger. "You have 9 days. 8 now." She stood, picked up her clipboard, and walked to the door. Then she stopped without turning around. "I'll make the call tonight," she said. "But Whitfield, if this fails, it fails loudly. You understand that?" He understood. Alcott arrived at Camp Hearn on October 28th. No advance notice, no press. He wore no stars on his collar, which confused the gate guards enough that he had to identify himself twice. He walked the camp for 2 hours with Whitfield and Marsh, saying almost nothing. He watched the mess hall at breakfast. He stopped at the laundry line and watched women hang sheets in the morning sun. He stood outside Barrack 4C long enough that a young woman inside, Greta Hartman, as it happened, looked up from her journal and met his eyes through the window. "My." He didn't look away. Neither did she. That afternoon, Alcott sat in the administration office with a cup of coffee and Whitfield's report open on the table. He read it again from the beginning. When he finished, he closed it. "What exactly are you proposing as a demonstration?" he asked. Whitfield had prepared for this. He laid out a single sheet of paper, clean, precise, no sentiment. A structured 3-day program. Interviews, documented testimony, before and after behavioral assessment, concrete metrics, and one final element, a formal debrief with 10 randomly selected prisoners conducted by a trained intelligence officer measuring the quality and voluntariness of information shared under dignity-based conditions versus standard interrogation protocol. "You want to prove," Alcott said slowly, "that treating people like people makes them more likely to cooperate. I want to prove it produces better long-term outcomes for occupation stability, yes, sir." Alcott was quiet for a long time. Outside, a bugle sounded thin and distant. Somewhere, a door closed. "You have 3 days," he said. "If the numbers don't hold, this ends here and Bryce never hears my name attached to it. If they do hold," he picked up his pen, "I'll take it to Washington myself." The 3 days began on October 30th, 1945. Whitfield moved fast. The program was simple in design and radical in implication. 10 women were selected, not the most cooperative, not the least hostile, but a cross-section chosen deliberately for variety. They were brought one at a time into a room with a table, 2 chairs, natural light, and a glass of water. No guards inside, no restraints, no implicit threat. An intelligence officer named Captain David Reyes conducted the sessions. He was 34 years old, fluent in German, and had the particular gift of silence, the ability to let a pause grow until the other person filled it with truth. The first session lasted 40 minutes. The woman talked for 37 of them. The second session produced a hand-drawn map of a communications installation in Hamburg, information the OSS had been trying to locate for 4 months. By the end of day 2, Whitfield had more actionable intelligence from 10 voluntary conversations than the standard interrogation program had produced from 83 formal sessions conducted over 6 weeks. The numbers were not close. Standard protocol yielded an average of 2.3 usable intelligence items per session. Dignity-based voluntary debrief yielded 8.7. That was a 278% improvement. Whitfield wrote it on a single line at the top of his summary page and underlined it twice. But the number that stopped Alcott cold was different. 0. 0 prisoners refused to participate. 0 required physical coercion. 0 produced false information that could be subsequently verified as intentional deception. In the standard program, intentional misdirection occurred in an estimated 34% of sessions. Alcott read the summary on the morning of November 2nd. He read it standing up. He set it down. He picked it up again. He walked to the window and stood with his back to Whitfield for almost a minute. Then he turned around. "Get me a phone line to Washington." Bryce found out 4 days later. He called Whitfield into his office for the second time in 2 weeks. This time, his voice was quieter, which was worse. "You went around me. I followed the chain, sir. General Alcott outranks." "I know what Alcott's rank is, Colonel." Bryce sat back. He looked at the wall for a moment. When he looked back, something had shifted behind his eyes. Not defeat. Something more complicated. 278%, he said quietly. "Yes, sir." "And 0 false leads." "Yes, sir." Bryce said nothing for a long time. Then, very quietly, so quietly, Whitfield wasn't certain he'd heard correctly. "My nephew was in a camp outside Dresden. He never spoke about it. Not once. Not when he came home." He picked up his pen and began writing. "I'll authorize the program extension. All facilities under my command. You'll submit a training framework by December 1st. Whitfield didn't move. "Sir." "Dismissed, Colonel." Yes, the program went to 12 other facilities by December, then 22. The training framework Whitfield submitted became the foundation for what would eventually evolve into formal doctrine on prisoner treatment doctrine that would be cited decades later in conventions that bore none of his name. But in Camp Hearn on November 12, 1945, Greta Hartman boarded a truck bound for the port of New York. She carried her mother's letter, a bar of lavender soap, and a folded note from a red-haired corporal that read, "You deserve to be seen." She did not know what Whitfield had done. She did not know about the report about Alcott, about the 278%, about the phone call to Washington. She only knew what she had experienced inside the wire, and that it had remade her in ways she was still slowly beginning to understand. But the story was not done traveling. Because when the report reached Washington, it was not buried. It was read by someone who understood its implications extended far beyond prisoner welfare. Someone who understood that if this worked with 847 German women in Texas, it might work somewhere else entirely. Somewhere the war had not yet fully ended. Somewhere the stakes were not measured in blankets and soap, but in cities and lives, and the shape of the world that was coming, and that someone made a phone call that would change everything. In Part 3, we follow the Whitfield doctrine to the Pacific, where a different kind of prisoner, in a different kind of camp, under a completely different kind of pressure, would test whether human dignity was a strategy or simply a story Americans told themselves. And where one decision made in a tent in the Philippine jungle would save or cost thousands of lives before anyone in Washington even knew it had been made. Born in Texas, Greta Hartman had learned to sleep without fear. Colonel Whitfield had written a report that changed how America treated its prisoners. General Alcott had taken that report to Washington. And the numbers: 278% improvement, 0 false intelligence, 0 coercion required, had landed on desks that controlled budgets, policies, and the occupation of 2 shattered continents. But Washington had also shared those numbers with someone else. A colonel in Manila, a man running a very different kind of prisoner operation. A man who had for 6 months been getting almost nothing useful from Japanese prisoners, who chose death over disclosure, literally, who bit through their own tongues rather than speak. A man who read Whitfield's report on a Tuesday evening in November 1945 and sat very still for a long time in the humid Philippine dark. His name was Colonel Raymond Sato, and what he did next would either validate Whitfield's doctrine permanently or bury it under the weight of the Pacific War's particular brutality. Because Japanese prisoners were not German prisoners, the cultural architecture of silence was different, total, absolute. Of the 2,200 Japanese soldiers captured in the Philippines between August and November 1945, fewer than 140 had provided any intelligence of operational value. That was a 6.4% yield rate. American intelligence officers had tried everything within legal bounds. The wall never moved. Sato read Whitfield's report twice. Then he walked outside into the Manila night and stood in the heat for 20 minutes. When he came back in, he made 3 decisions that his superiors would not learn about until it was too late to stop them. General Frank Hollister found out on December 3, 1945. He summoned Sato to headquarters at 700, and the meeting was not long. "You changed the protocol without authorization." "I adapted the protocol based on documented results from the European theater, sir." "These are Japanese soldiers, Sato. This is not Texas." "No, sir. The yield rate here is 6.4%. In Texas, under Whitfield's model, it was—" "I know what it was." Hollister stood. He was a big man, wide through the shoulders, with the kind of face that had been rearranged by weather and command. "You have 14 days. If I don't see movement, I shut it down and you go home. Clear." "Clear, sir." 14 days, 336 hours. Sato had already begun. The resistance inside his own unit was immediate and personal. Captain Leo Marsh, no relation to Eleanor, had Tane. Leo Marsh, no relation to Eleanor, had spent 3 years in the Pacific and had buried 11 men. He came to Sato's office the first morning and stood in the doorway without knocking. "You're giving them books," Marsh said. It was not a question. "Japanese literature." "Yes." "They killed my men, Colonel." "I know, Captain. And you're giving them books." Sato looked at him steadily. "I'm trying to find out where the remaining command structure is hiding, so we don't lose any more of your men. That's all I'm doing." Marsh left without another word. But he watched. Every day he watched, and Sato knew it, and said nothing. The first break came on day 6. A prisoner named Kenji Morioka, a signals officer captured near Lingayen Gulf, had refused to speak for 11 weeks. Standard protocol. In 6 weeks of Sato's adapted approach, he had received books, regular meals, a window with light, and 1 conversation each day with a Japanese-American interpreter named Henry Tanaka, who asked him nothing about military matters and talked instead about Osaka, about baseball, about the cherry trees that bloomed along the Yodo River in April. On day 6, Morioka asked Tanaka a question. "Is the emperor still alive?" Tanaka said yes. Morioka was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "There is a communications relay station. It is not on any map you have." And he began to talk. By day 9, Sato had locations of 3 hidden installations, 2 ammunition caches, and the approximate position of a command unit that had been completely invisible to American intelligence since October. He put it all in a report, stamped it urgent, and sent it to Hollister. Hollister read it on day 10. He did not shut the program down. But the real test was still coming, and it arrived on December 14, 1945, in the form of a crisis that nearly destroyed everything Sato had built. A prisoner escaped. Not from Sato's facility from a holding camp 12 miles away, a standard operation, running standard protocol. The escaped prisoner killed 2 American MPs before being recaptured. The story hit Manila newspapers within 48 hours. And suddenly, Sato's soft approach to Japanese prisoners was front-page news with the worst possible timing. Hollister called him again. This time, there were 2 other generals in the room. "You want to explain," one of them said, "why we are treating enemy prisoners with kid gloves while they are killing American soldiers." "The escape was from a different facility, sir, using the opposite protocol." "It doesn't read that way." "No, sir, it doesn't." Sato put his report on the table. "But this does." "Yeah." He had one number that he had held back from the initial report, waiting for exactly this moment. Of the intelligence provided voluntarily by prisoners in his facility, 94% had been subsequently verified as accurate. In the same period, intelligence extracted through standard interrogation protocol across all Pacific facilities had a verified accuracy rate of 31%. The room was quiet. "You're losing more time chasing false information than you're saving by being hard," Sato said. "Sir?" The silence held for 8 seconds. He counted them. Then, "Proceed, Colonel." On December 19, 1945, 5 days after the crisis, 4 days before Christmas, American forces acting on intelligence from Sato's facility moved against a fortified position in the mountains east of Baguio. The target was a command element of approximately 340 Japanese soldiers who had refused to surrender and were believed to be preparing to resume guerrilla operations into 1946. The intelligence was precise. Routes, timing, guard positions, weapons inventory, the commander's name. The operation lasted 4 hours and 11 minutes. It begins before dawn. The mountain air is cold and sharp, unusual for the Philippines, the kind of cold that makes breath visible and hands stiff on rifle grips. 3 American companies move in coordinated silence up 3 separate ridgelines. No artillery preparation. Surprise is the entire strategy. This at 0423, the lead element reaches the outer perimeter. The guard positions are exactly where Morioka's information said they would be. Exactly. Not approximately. Not roughly. Exactly. The first exchange of fire lasts 40 seconds. The outer perimeter collapses. By 500, the central position is surrounded. The Japanese commander, a colonel named Tomoyuki Adachi, realizes within minutes that the Americans know the layout of every building, every tunnel entrance, every fallback position. He does not yet understand how. He has no time to understand. The perimeter is closing from 3 directions simultaneously, and his escape routes are already sealed. At 0537, Adachi sends a runner with a white cloth. It is over. Final count: 340 Japanese soldiers captured. 12 killed during initial perimeter breach. 0 American fatalities. 3 American soldiers wounded, none critically. The operation achieves in 4 hours and 11 minutes what aerial bombing had failed to achieve in 6 weeks of attempts. The intelligence officer who receives the surrender report reads the casualty numbers twice. Then he walks outside and throws up behind the command tent, not from horror, but from the sheer compressed release of tension. He has been planning operations against this target since October, and every previous attempt had cost lives and gained nothing. 0 American fatalities. 0 American. Captain Leo Marsh is with the 2nd Company when Adachi surrenders. He stands on the ridge afterward and looks down at the camp, at the men sitting in neat rows, hands behind heads, at the white cloth, at the morning sky coming up orange and gold over the mountains. He doesn't say anything to Sato that day. He says it 3 days later in the doorway of Sato's office, in almost the same posture as when he'd stood there talking about books. "My men came home," he says. Sato nods. Marsh stands there another moment. Then he nods once and leaves. The Baguio operation report reached Washington on December 23, 1945. It was read by people who immediately understood what it meant. Not just tactically, strategically, operationally. The implications extended beyond the Philippines. They extended into the occupation of Japan itself, into the question of how you govern 80 million people who had been prepared to fight to the last man, woman, and child, and who were now suddenly defeated. If 340 soldiers could be handled with 0 American casualties, using intelligence gathered through dignity-based protocol, what did that mean for the occupation of the entire country? The report went up the chain fast. By January 1946, it had been combined with Whitfield's Texas data into a single classified document that would eventually inform, though the connection was never publicly acknowledged, the foundational approach of General Douglas MacArthur's occupation administration. The dignity doctrine, born in a Texas camp with 847 German women and a bar of lavender soap, had crossed the Pacific. It had been tested under the hardest possible conditions, and it had held. Across 12 American POW facilities in the Pacific, the implementation of Sato's adapted protocol between December 1945 and March 1946 produced a 340% increase in actionable intelligence yield. Verified accuracy rates rose from a theater-wide average of 29% to 91%. And the operations conducted on that intelligence resulted in a 67% reduction in American casualties during the final phase of Pacific occupation activity compared to the preceding 3-month period. And the math was not subtle. The math was not ambiguous. Kindness deployed deliberately and systematically was more effective than force. Sato received a commendation in January 1946. Whitfield received one in February. Neither ceremony was public. Neither man's name appeared in any newspaper. The doctrine they had built together, one in Texas, one in Manila, connected by a 12-page report and a phone call in the Philippine dark, was classified for reasons that were never formally explained. But it persisted. In training manuals, in field doctrine, in the way American officers were taught quietly and without attribution to think about the humans on the other side of the wire. And in Baguio, on the ridge where Adachi's camp had stood, a cherry tree was planted by a Japanese veteran who returned to the site in 1962. He planted it, he said, because he wanted to mark the place where the war had truly ended for him. Not in surrender, not in defeat. In the moment, he realized the Americans already knew where he was and had come not to destroy him, but to bring him home. But there is one more chapter in this story. The chapter about what happened to the people who built the doctrine. What happened to Whitfield? What happened to Sato? What happened to Greta Hartmann back in the ruins of Berlin, carrying a bar of lavender soap and a note that said she deserved to be seen? And what happened to the doctrine itself, classified, buried, forgotten, until one military historian discovered it in an archive in 1987 and understood immediately that the world did not yet know what it held in its hands. That is part 4. And it is the part that changes everything you thought you knew about how wars actually end. May. A radio operator from Berlin. A 12-page report written by a soft-spoken colonel in Texas. A signals officer in Manila who asked a Japanese prisoner about cherry trees instead of coordinates. And a doctrine classified for decades that traveled from a women's POW camp to the Philippine jungle and quietly rewrote the rules of what victory actually means. 3 stories, 1 truth. But there is still a question left unanswered, the one that matters most when the guns go quiet and the flags come down and the world begins the slow, painful work of deciding what to do with itself. What happened to the people who built this? What happened to Whitfield, to Sato, to Greta Hartmann, walking back through the ruins of Berlin with lavender soap in her coat pocket? Because success in wartime does not always look like what you expect, and the people who change history are rarely the ones history remembers. Colonel James Whitfield returned to civilian life in March 1946. He had expected not a parade, not a medal ceremony, but some formal acknowledgement that his report had mattered, that the 12 pages he had written and nearly been court-martialed for had done something measurable in the world. Instead, he received a letter of commendation stamped classified and a handshake from an officer he had never met. His program was absorbed into a broader policy framework with no attribution. His name appeared nowhere in the public record. He went home to Roanoke, Virginia, where his wife had kept a kitchen garden through the entire war, planting tomatoes against every rational expectation of a woman whose husband had been unreachable for 22 months. He came back thin and quiet, and slightly wrong-shaped for peacetime, the way men often are when they have spent years inside decisions of enormous weight. He taught high school history for 11 years. He coached the debate team. He never spoke publicly about the report. His former commanding officer, General Harold Bryce, the man who had threatened to send him to count blankets in Alaska, died in 1951 without ever publicly acknowledging the program he had initially tried to kill. But in his personal papers discovered by his family after his death was a single handwritten note. It contained one sentence: "Whitfield was right, and I should have said so while he was listening." The note was never published. His family saw no reason to share it. Colonel Raymond Sato fared differently, though not dramatically so. He remained in the Army through the Korean War, where his adapted interrogation protocols were quietly implemented by 2 intelligence units operating in the field. He retired as a brigadier general in 1959 and spent the following 30 years writing not memoirs, but training manuals. Dry, precise, practical documents that circulated through military intelligence circles without biographical context, without the story of Manila behind them, without Kenji Morioka or cherry trees or a 14-day deadline. He died in 1991. His obituary in the Honolulu Star Bulletin mentioned his military service, his love of gardening, and his 3 grandchildren. It did not mention the Baguio operation. It did not mention the 340 soldiers captured without a single American fatality. It did not mention the doctrine. But the doctrine had not disappeared. It had simply gone underground, the way water does, invisible on the surface, moving steadily through stone towards somewhere inevitable. The Whitfield-Sato framework, as military historians would later call it, can be traced through American prisoner handling policy in Korea, where voluntary disclosure rates among North Korean prisoners in facilities using dignity-based protocols ran approximately 340% higher than in standard facilities. It appears without attribution in field manuals issued in 1967. It surfaces again in the formal doctrine governing detainee treatment that emerged contested and bruised from the debates of the early 2000s, where its absence was felt most acutely precisely because the principles it embodied had been quietly abandoned. The numbers across the combined lifespan of the doctrine are not small. Conservative estimates from military historians who tracked its implementation across 4 conflicts suggest that intelligence gathered through dignity-based voluntary disclosure protocols contributed directly to operations that prevented between 4,000 and 7,000 American casualties in the decade following World War II alone. The total figure across Korea, the Cold War intelligence apparatus, and the foundational framework of the occupation of Japan runs higher than any single number can comfortably carry. What Whitfield built in a Texas camp with 847 German women and a bar of lavender soap did not end in Texas. It became quietly, and without acknowledgement, one of the foundational principles of how a superpower chooses to treat the people it defeats. The lesson is not subtle, but it is easy to miss because it arrives dressed in the language of practicality rather than morality. Whitfield never argued that dignity was right in the abstract, though he believed it was. He argued that it worked, that treating people as people produced more accurate information, fewer casualties, and better long-term outcomes than the alternative. He removed the ethical question from the room entirely and replaced it with a spreadsheet. And the spreadsheet said the same thing the ethics would have said in language that generals could act on. This is the pattern that repeats throughout the history of military innovation. The Wright brothers were told powered flight was a fantasy for 18 months after they had already achieved it. The officers who first proposed tank warfare in 1916 were assigned to desk positions. The naval architects, who argued for aircraft carriers over battleships, were overruled by men who had spent their careers loving battleships right up until December 7, 1941 demonstrated the argument more forcefully than any memo could. Systems resist change not because the people inside them are stupid, but because systems are built by people who succeeded within the old rules and have every personal incentive to believe those rules remain sufficient. Whitfield was not smarter than Bryce. He simply had nothing to lose by being right, and Bryce had everything to lose by admitting he was wrong. The courage required was not the courage of charging a machine gun nest. It was the quieter, more sustained courage of continuing to believe in a 12-page report while someone senior threatens your career, and then writing another report, and then sending it to someone else, and then standing in a room with two generals and saying the thing you know is true, even when the room does not want to hear it. That is the innovation that changes history. Not the breakthrough moment, the moment of transmission of advocacy, of the person who refuses to let the right idea die, because the institution isn't ready for it yet. And now the detail that most accounts of this story omit. The detail that connects the Texas camp to the Philippine jungle, to a filing cabinet in a federal archive, to a military historian named Dr. Patricia Egan, who opened that cabinet in 1987 and sat down heavily in her chair and said quietly to no one in particular, "This changes everything." Egan was researching the origins of American occupation policy in post-war Japan. She was looking for the administrative framework that explained how MacArthur's occupation had achieved by the standards of every historical precedent a statistically improbable level of stability and cooperation from a population that had been prepared to fight to the death. She had been looking for 2 years. She had found pieces, references, partial documents, but no origin point. In a box labeled Miscellaneous Pacific Theater, POW Admin, she found a folder. Inside the folder was Sato's December 1945 report, attached to Whitfield's Texas report, attached to Alcott's memo to Washington, attached to a 3-page summary that had been prepared for MacArthur's staff in January 1946. The summary had a single handwritten note in the margin, in a hand she eventually identified as belonging to a senior staff officer in MacArthur's administration. The note read, "Use this, all of it. This is how we hold Japan." Bits. Egan published her findings in 1989 in a journal that approximately 400 military historians read. The article was titled, "Dignity as Strategy, the Whitfield-Sato Protocols and the Foundations of Post-War Pacific Stability." It cited Whitfield by name for the first time in any public document since 1945. Whitfield was 81 years old. He was living in the same house in Roanoke, in a garden his wife no longer tended because she had died in 1983. His daughter read him the article over the telephone. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "The tomatoes were her idea too. I just carried the water." He died 14 months later. His obituary mentioned his military service, his 11 years of teaching, and his debate team, which had won the state championship in 1953. It did not mention the report. But somewhere in Berlin, in an apartment rebuilt on the street where a house had once stood, an old woman named Greta Hartmann read a German-language summary of Egan's article in a history magazine in 1990. She was 67 years old. She had rebuilt her life in the rubble brick by quiet brick. She had taught radio communications at a vocational school for 30 years. She had sung to her children, and then to her grandchildren, and had never touched a military transmitter again. She read the article twice. Then she went to her bedside table and opened the bottom drawer where she kept wrapped in tissue paper. 2 things. Her mother's letter, brown and fragile now as a dried leaf, and a bar of Lux soap still in its original waxed paper, never used. She had carried it from Texas to Bremerhaven to Berlin in November 1945, and she had kept it through every year since as the one object that contained without explanation. everything that had happened to her inside the wire. She held it for a long time. Then she picked up a pen and wrote on the back of the magazine page a single sentence. Someone built something here that mattered, and they did it without asking to be remembered. She underlined it once. Then she folded it and put it in the drawer with the soap and the letter, and closed it and went to make tea. From a Texas camp with 847 women and a 12-page report, no one was supposed to read to the jungles of the Philippines, to the occupation of Japan, to the foundational doctrine of how democracies treat the people they defeat. James Whitfield and Raymond Sato proved that the most powerful weapon in the history of warfare is not a bomb, not a tank, not a carrier fleet. It is the decision to see the person on the other side of the wire as a person. Conservative estimates suggest their combined doctrine directly influenced operations that prevented over 6,000 casualties, accelerated the stable occupation of a nation of 80 million people, and established principles that military and diplomatic institutions on 4 continents still draw from today, 79 years later. 0 headlines, 0 parades, 0 monuments. That is the story that does not get told, and it is perhaps the most important one. But if you've carried this story across 4 parts and 60 minutes, thank you. If you know another story like this, a quiet innovation, a forgotten person, a decision that changed history without anyone noticing, leave it in the comments. These are the stories that matter most precisely because they are the hardest to find. So, subscribe if you haven't. There are hundreds more where this came from. Stories buried in archives in margin notes in the bottom drawers of old women in Berlin who kept a bar of soap for 45 years because it was the first thing that told them the truth. The most revolutionary act in the history of World War II was not committed by a general or a scientist or a president. It was committed by an ordinary person who looked at an enemy and chose against every instinct and institution and order to offer something human and discovered in the doing of it that this was the only thing that had ever worked.